paint a bedroom like this is that you're going to want to clear out as much of the things that are going to get in your way as possible. So you're going to move all the little stuff out of the way, move the furniture away from the walls. If you have small pieces of furniture that you can get out of that room to get them out of your way, do that. And just basically, like I did in this room that you can see, basically leave the bigger pieces of furniture in there. They won't get in your way too much if they're in the middle of the room and you have room around the edges to set your ladder up and your drops and everything. So, if you're painting the ceiling, then obviously you have to cover everything in the room completely because you never know where the paint's going to go. So you need plastic over all your furniture, you need drops on the ground. But if you're not painting the ceiling, there's no reason to put the plastic all over the furniture in the middle of the room. I mean, you're not going to be throwing paint around. It's not going to come flying off the wall, so you're safe in just having a drop on the ground next to the wall. Also, part of your prep work, you need to fill any cracks that you have around doorways, along the ceiling line, and so on with some caulking. Just use some regular paintable caulk and put it in there and wipe it off with a rag. Use a damp rag to wipe it off. And then if you've got any holes that need to be filled, you need to fill those as well with some sort of patch, drywall patch. And when you apply that, just shove it into the hole with your finger and don't leave any excess on the wall. If you leave excess on the wall, now you got to go back and sand it. But if you just shove it in there and wipe off any excess with your hand when it's wet, it's done. You're ready to go. And don't be afraid to paint over that. You should be okay just painting right away on top of your patch. Then the next thing you're going to do is take off anything that's going to get in the way that you can possibly take off, like plug plates, any hardware for curtains, any brackets for anything. If they're screwed into the wall and it's going to be easy to put them back in, just take them off. And that way it's going to be much faster. You can just roll stuff instead of using the brush work so much and having to cut everything. And when you take off the plates, put the little screws back in the holes that they came in. So that way when you go to put the plates back in, when you're finished painting, you don't have a hard time finding the screws. They're right there where they belong. And you just collect all the plates in one spot. That'll be out of the way and won't get paint on them. So after you take off the hardware and all that stuff and the plug plates, the next thing you're going to do is tape off the carpeting. If you have carpeting in the room that you're painting in, you're going to take some 2-inch masking tape, and don't buy real cheap masking tape because it will rip on you like crazy and it's just not worth saving the $1 or $2 to get the cheap stuff. Go ahead and get the good, I use like 3M 2-inch masking tape around the baseboards. And what you do is you shove it in just like this. You're going to be, pulling it out, stretch it out pretty far past where you're working, and then shove it in down into the baseboard. And that way you're holding the carpeting down so that when you paint there, the paint's going to go lower than the level of the carpeting. And when you're done painting and the baseboards are dry, you pull the tape up and the carpeting springs back and covers up any area that might be unpainted. And so you can never tell that even that you missed anything at all, where there might be a little area way down in there, deep down in the baseboard. So just tape off the whole room all the way around, and try not to get any of the tape up onto the wall because wherever there's tape there's not going to be paint, so you got to be careful about that. After you got it taped off, then you're going to lay your drops down. I like to use cloth drops. They're a little bit more expensive. If you're planning on painting, doing several painting jobs, I really recommend investing in some cloth drops rather than the plastic ones. The reason I like the cloth drops better is that the plastic ones, when you get paint on them, the paint does not soak in at all. And it stays wet for a really long time, and you end up tracking it around on the bottom of your shoes when you don't even realize it, and then you're tracking paint through the house because eventually you're going to walk off of those drops that you're painting on, and they don't lay as nicely on the floor, it just, they tend to be a big mess. And so the whole purpose of drops, of course, is to keep your house clean when you're painting, and so I really prefer the cloth drops, and those cloth drops last pretty much forever. So your investment is gonna last you a while. When you lay the drop down, you want to try to put it right next to the baseboard and have it line up perfectly with the wall. Don't have it laying up against the wall, all crammed up against it. Lay it out nicely, and that way you can roll right down next to the baseboard without smacking your roller on top of the drop and making a mess out of the drop. But you do want to make sure that the drop completely covers all your carpeting. That's another advantage of having the masking tape down, though, is that it provides a little 2-inch buffer where your drop could slide back from the wall a little bit and your carpeting is still covered. After your drops are laid sufficiently and everything's covered nicely, it's time to begin painting. And you're going to start painting by cutting in all the areas that need to be cut in. I like to cut in first before I roll, because when I roll, I overlap all my cut-ins as much as I possibly can, because the roller applies more paint than the brush does. And so to keep the paint nice and thick, I'm going to overlap my cut-ins, and it's going to be less obvious in terms of seeing any kind of difference in drying and things like that if you do the cut-in first and then you overlap that with your roller strokes. And so I start by going around the room, cutting in the ceiling, cut in the corners, cut in around all my plates. You're going to cut in any place that the roller can't get, or where you're in danger of hitting something with the roller and getting paint on something you don't want to get on. And right here, the roller might hit these screws, which will be exposed when we put the plate back on. The roller could, if you get too close, it could hit the actual plug here, and then you'd have paint on the plug, and that would be pretty ugly. So this is cutting it in. I don't need to cut in real wide there, because I should still be able to get pretty close with the roller once I come back and roll the wall. I don't want to waste my time brushing a bunch of stuff that I could be rolling, because the roller is a lot faster than the brush is. This plate can't come off the wall because it's part of the cable, so it just kind of sits out there like that. And I'm not cutting in the baseboard yet. The baseboard will be cut in after I paint, because if I cut it in right now, you see the drop will come back and touch. I need to keep the drop nice and close to the wall so I don't get any paint on the carpeting. But if I cut it in now, then the drop will come back and touch the paint. It'll mess up the paint, and it'll get paint all over the drop, which then could end up getting smeared on the carpeting and make a mess. When you cut in, you want to load your brush up, keep it nice and wet. Try to keep the paint down at the end of your brush. Don't let it get down towards your handle. Keep wiping that thing off on the edge of your bucket, otherwise you're going to end up with a big mess all over your hand of paint. So keep that paint down on the tips of the brush. And if you see that the paint is starting to thin out at all when you're brushing, go for another dip. Keep that bucket nice and close to you. I dip straight out of the bucket. I make sure that I'm wiping on one side of the bucket so that I keep one rim of the bucket dry for putting my brush inside the bucket and then leaning the handle up against that dry side. If I am always wiping out of different sides of the bucket, then the whole brim ends up getting wet with paint, and I've got no way of setting my brush in the bucket and leaning it up against the side without getting paint all over the handle. Now, why do I want to put my brush inside the bucket? Well, when I take a break from brushing and I go to my rolling phase, I got to keep that brush wet. If I just set my brush out someplace and go to rolling, and I'm rolling for a while, that brush is going to get dried out. And I don't want dry paint on my brush. It's going to make it harder to paint, and it's going to ruin the paintbrush. I do invest in a pretty good paintbrush because the paint goes on so much better, so much faster. The kind I buy are Purdy, P-U-R-D-Y, Purdy paintbrushes. And you can see a list of all the supplies that you need here on the website. But I spend probably about $16 for a brush for cutting in. Now normally in a room like this, the kind of cutting in you're doing, it doesn't require a small brush where you're getting into really tight spaces. So I buy a healthy sized brush, usually a 3 to a 3.5 inch brush. That way I can load that thing up with paint and go a lot faster when I'm working my way around the room. Alright, now I'm cutting in the corners here. I don't have to cut in hardly at all on the corners because the roller is going to be moving this way and I should be able to get pretty close to the corner. And besides, there's no danger. I mean, if I hit the other surface with the roller, it's not like I'm going to ruin anything because I'm painting that anyway. So basically the roller just can't get all the way into the corner. So I'm just shoving the brush into the actual little crack area there to make sure that gets covered with paint. And then I've got these brackets here that I've got to go around. And I definitely need to cut these in carefully because I don't want any paint at all on the brackets. So the technique that I use here is that I make sure my brush is plenty loaded up with paint, and then I'm pushing the brush into the wall, letting the bristles go away from the handle, and I'm staring right at where the paint's being applied and just making sure that I do not hit the bracket. If I leave a little extra spot where I didn't put paint on the wall, that's okay, I can go back and get that. But it's much harder to get the paint off of the bracket than it is to apply a little bit extra paint where you missed because you didn't get close enough. So I'm just being real careful here, going pretty slow, just smashing my brush into the wall and letting the bristles work their way out over toward the actual edge there that I'm trying to get a nice straight edge on. And I'm applying a liberal amount of paint. I don't want it to bleed through at all if possible. Alright, one thing that makes it go faster when you're painting is that you want the bucket of paint up near you where you're not having to bend over and go back up all the time, you know, to go get your paint, to dip your brush. So you can see I have a nice 4-foot ladder here. I've set the bucket of paint on the steps of the ladder, on the bucket shelf, and that way as I'm painting it's just a real quick dip of the bucket and I'm off and brushing again. So don't leave your bucket on the ground if you can avoid it. It will save you a lot of time doing this. So what I do is I put this hook, I make a hook out of like a coat hanger and wrap it around one of the top steps on my extension ladder. That way I got a place to hang my bucket so I can have my hands free and continue to paint. And it's nothing fancy, but it works well. Keeps the bucket there while I'm cutting in. Just like that. I know I've talked to some people that like to think they should tape off the ceiling, put masking tape up there. That is a ton of work, and it really doesn't do you a whole lot of good. The paint's going to probably end up bleeding under the masking tape, so it's best just to, when you cut that in, just go along real closely like this, real carefully, and cut along your wall like that, and just make sure you don't hit the ceiling. So after you have everything cut in, then you go to the roller, and you'll notice a couple things about the way I'm rolling and the kind of materials that I'm using. First of all, and most importantly, this is one of the biggest secrets for successful painting and for saving time, and that is using a lamb's wool cover. Don't buy the polyester kind. These lamb's wool covers are just amazing. They soak up so much paint so you're dipping way less often, and they apply the paint in such a nice smooth manner that you're not getting the the gaps in, you know, missing paint. We call those holidays. You don't have holidays all over the wall like you do with the regular polyester kind. Now again, the lamb's wool covers cost a little bit more than the polyester kind do. Normally you can get the lamb's wool covers for about 10 bucks or so, which is probably double of what you pay for the other type. And I use a, but you know, what's an extra 5 bucks? I mean, look at how often you're using the roller all the way around your room. You want to get a good roller cover. And I just use a regular roller handle. Doesn't really matter, you know, a pretty decent one so that it'll keep moving nicely for me. And I use on the roller cover, I use about a 1.5 inch nap, 1 inch to 2 inch, somewhere in there on your nap length. You want it to be pretty long. That way you can soak up more paint. And then the other thing that you use is this handle here. And it's a telescoping extension pole. It just screws right into the handle of the roller right there. You can see it just screws right in there. And it's nice because it's pretty short when you're working in some tight areas, but then you can loosen it up and extend it out when you can't reach too well. Now, why use an extension pole? Well, if you don't use this pole, it's going to take you so much longer to roll the walls. Even if you're just doing one wall, you still want to use an extension pole. Now, the other thing that you want to use that's going to really help you is this screen in a bucket. The cost for this thing is like a couple of bucks for this screen, and then when you want to move the bucket, you know, when you want to move your paint source, you just grab the bucket like that and you move it. I mean, there's no bending all the way over the floor to pick up that tray. It's ridiculous. Don't mess with those trays. Just buy yourself a little screen, stick it in a 5-gallon bucket like this. You can pour like 2 gallons of paint at a time in the bucket, and you're not having to go back and pour all the time over and over again. So stay away from the trays. Let me show you how I go about rolling. I always want to keep my roller nice and wet. Basically, you just want to apply the paint. You want to make it nice and smooth. You don't want to have big, thick glops of paint on the wall, and you don't want to have spots where the old color shows through. So I always apply the paint to the dry part first, like this, dry area, and I work my way back into where I've already painted, and I make sure that I overlap the part that's already done a lot, and I go over everything 3, 4, 5 times before I move on to the next section of the wall. Because you might not see that spot that you missed that well. The lighting can really fake you out. But you want it, if you go over it and over and over it, you're pretty well guaranteed that you're not going to have any missing spots. So I apply it, I smooth it out. I try to keep my roller up and down this way. If you turn it side to side like that, sometimes the paint builds up inside the roller and you end up with gravity pulling that paint right out of there and you make a big mess. So you keep it this way as much as possible. You know, a couple of seconds on the side isn't going to hurt, but I'm mainly going up and down, as you can see. And you want to keep your bucket close to you, but not in your way. So always close at hand, but not like where you're going to be bumping into it or knocking it over, where it's getting in your way from being able to work quickly. Oh, see, I'm going up this wall here. It's starting to get a little bit hard to reach with the length of pole that I have. So what I think I'm going to do is finish out here. I've got a bookcase back here that's in my way. Go ahead, Mike. Got a bookcase here, and I don't have a whole lot of room in here with this extension pole. So I'm going to finish this out with the length pole that I have right now, and then extend my pole out to be able to reach the higher part of the ceiling. So if I extend the pole out right now, the pole will get in my way. It'll be smacking into this bookshelf and be a real pain. You can see how fast paint goes on using this method and using the lamb's wool cover. Of course, not using a tray. Okay, now I'm going to extend out my pole and make it a little bit easier to reach. Now when you dip the roller in the bucket, you use the screen to get off all the excess paint. Well, I shouldn't say that, not all the excess paint. You want to leave on as much paint as you possibly can. Your goal is to make it so that the paint won't be dripping off your roller when you're taking it from the bucket to the wall. And then the first movement that I make of my roller after dipping it is going to be a very gradual, slow upstroke. I'm going to move it up first to try to avoid splattering the paint or squishing it so that the paint starts rolling down the wall. So take it easy when you first have that fresh dip of paint on there. And remember, always apply it to the dry spot first. Now when you roll at the bottom here by the baseboards, I mean, granted that if you're painting the baseboards, you want to roll down as far as you possibly can. I actually try to hit the baseboard without hitting the drop, of course. Now if you have the drop in place like you're supposed to, you should be able to roll down real close to the bottom. You're going to save yourself a lot of time when you go back to cut that in with a brush at the end. You want to roll over your vents. You cut them in first. Cut the vents in first, and then roll over the top of the vent to give it a nice extra coat of paint, because when you're cutting it in, you're going to leave all kinds of brush marks probably on that thing. And you got to have a fairly dry roller when you go over it, otherwise you're going to end up with all kinds of runs. The reason I paint the vents is that a vent is not an item in the room that I really want to accent or highlight. And if I left it white while the rest of the room was painted a different color, it's almost like I'm saying, hey, look at my vent. You know, isn't this a nice vent here? And I don't really want to bring attention to the vent, so I paint it so that it'll blend in.
Ow.
Now, see, these types of spots here, when you're cutting, you don't need to cut this. I see people painting and they cut around edges like this. Well, how come you can't roll that? Look at that. Very simple to roll outside corners. You only need to cut your inside corners. Even that corner right there is easy to roll. Okay. So what you're going to do, the last thing that you're painting pretty much here is the baseboards after you've rolled everything, and you're pulling the drop away so that it's not touching the baseboard anymore. I'm not too worried about the paint dripping on the carpet. I'm just real careful at this point in time. And I'm getting lots of paint on my brush, and I'm slopping it right down there on the baseboard, all the way down to the tape. I'm not afraid to get the paint on the tape. It's no big deal. It'll all just come off when I pull the tape up once the paint's dry. Okay, after you're done cleaning up, then you got to clean up your paint. And this is what I do with the roller. Take a screwdriver, scrape the paint out. That way the paint is saved. You don't waste a bunch of paint, and it also makes the roller easier to clean when you take it into the sink or to your water source. So you just keep scraping at it like this until most of the paint is out and back in the bucket. You don't really have to clean the screen a whole lot. The paint dries on there like that, it doesn't really hurt anything. Alright, then I'm going to clean everything up here. So we're going to clean out the roller using some warm water. So you keep rinsing this thing until there is absolutely no paint coming out when you squeeze this. You don't want to leave any paint at all inside this cover. Otherwise it will not work too great the next time. Get all dried and hard and cracked. Get it nice and clean. Now when you clean the brush, you can see if I just use water, I'm going to end up with a bunch of paint right in here, and this paint will dry, and then the whole brush will get really stiff and won't be flexible anymore. And you spend a lot of money on these brushes, so you got to get all that paint out of there. The trick to getting the paint out of those is to use a wire brush. You just go with the grain of the bristles, and you push pretty hard, get down in there, and then what you want to do is turn the water upside down, turn your brush upside down, have the water flowing through, like that, and as long as there's paint coming out of there, when you do that, it's not clean yet. You got to keep squeezing and twisting that until there's absolutely no paint coming out of this part right here. And there it is, nice and clean. Okay, and then you don't want to leave a lot of water in the brush, so the trick to getting it out is you just smack it on the end of your shoe like that. Dries it out quite a bit better. And store this in the case that it came in. And then shake out your roller as well to get most of the water out of it. Break it away first. Break it away first.